The first Castlevania game was first released on the NES in 1986 by Konami. It is a platforming game where players take control of Simon Belmont, a descendant of the Belmont family who uses his ancestral whip, the Vampire Killer, against many creatures and foes before defeating his arch-enemy, Count Dracula himself. He travels to the demonic castle, Castlevania, and fights his way through the castle, destroying Dracula himself and the castle. Secondary weapons in Castlevania are powered by hearts, collected by attacking candles and killing monsters, which is like ammunition in a certain way. The secondary weapons are the daggers, the holy water, the flying axe, the stopwatch, and the cross. Hidden items such as power-ups and food, health replenishment items are also found by attacking walls within the levels, a feature inspired by Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. With countless hidden items across the game's levels. However, the stopwatch costs 5 hearts, thus using hearts up rather quickly. But the good thing about it is that it freezes enemies for a short time, and also players can take advantage of it by getting through tougher areas. Vampire Killer, released in 1986 for MXS Computer, took a departure from the traditional platform gameplay of Castlevania, instead introducing an open-ended form of gameplay. The game's non-linear design had a similar structure to the Metroid game released that same year. The sequel to the original game was Simon's Quest, released 30 years ago. Unlike its predecessor, this had a non-linear gameplay and more open-ended world than that of Vampire Killer and Metroid, with several exclusive elements such as world map that was free for players to explore and visit. Simon can talk to townspeople who will offer him clues or lies. He starts with a standard leather whip, which can be upgraded by a merchant with each new purchase. This game also introduced an EXP system, which is increased by collecting hearts. Experience systems are typically in RPG games like Final Fantasy, Lufia, and so on, and some people compared this game to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. The period of time in Simon's Quest cycles between day and night, which has a prominent effect on the game's and Simon's encounters. During the day, enemies outside of towns in the game are weaker, but at night, it's the contrary, and they inflict more damage to Simon's life points. Though when defeated, they drop more hearts. The townspeople and merchants in the respective locations are no longer available to talk during the night, and are replaced by zombies and other creatures. Despite the departure from the previous game, there are elements that have remained. This includes magic weapons, which are secondary to Simon's whip. Each of them have a different use. Like most games in the series, some of these require the usage of hearts. One of them, returning from Castlevania, is the holy water, a small glass which can disintegrate walls that conceal hidden items. Some magic weapons make their first appearance in Simon's Quest, such as the diamond, which attacks enemies while bouncing off any surrounding walls. The objective of the game is to travel to the 5 mansions to find the body parts of Dracula's corpse and an item known as a magic cross. The body parts can be utilized to support Simon in the game. For example, Dracula's rib can be used as a shield to block any projectile attacks from any enemy. Finding all the required items will allow Simon to clear the blockade in front of Dracula's castle to fight the last boss. After the player defeats Dracula, there are 3 possible endings based on the time taken to complete the game. The best ending is achieved when the player beats a game in 8 game days or less. Simon's Quest, however, provoked some controversy upon its release, receiving strong publicity in the second issue of Nintendo Power. Its front page had a costume model dressed as Simon Belmont, holding Dracula's severed head. This cover angered many parents of children who purchased the magazine, stating that it gave their kids nightmares. Nintendo Power covered this in volume 50 of the magazine, which cited this as its worst cover. Simon's Quest gameplay elements will be used in future games such as Symphony of the Night, Circle of the Moon, Harmony of Dissonance, Aria and Dawn of Sorrow, and Portrait of Ruin. The third installment in the franchise, Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse, was released in 1989, 28 years ago. The gameplay returns to its original platforming roots and introduced a new Belmont, Trevor. However, he was not the only character that was playable. The game introduced 3 new characters, Grand Dynasty, Sypha Belnades, and fan favorite Alucard. Grand Dynasty had the ability to climb onto walls and change direction in mid-jump. Sypha Belnades had poor physical attacks, but her magical powers packed a punch. Alucard, a half-human, half-vampire hybrid, had the abilities to shoot fireballs and transform into a bat. The player can spiritually transform between Trevor and his ally with a select button. Both Trevor and whoever is accompanying him share the same health meter. The ending of the game differs depending on which companion Trevor has with him at the time, or if he does not take a character with him at all. There are 2 main routes to the game's 16 stages. The second stage is an optional excursion for picking up one of the 3 partner characters, and the main branch occurs part way through the 3rd stage. Each route contains a total of 9 stages, 10 if the player takes the optional second stage. The upper route takes the player across the lake to the main bridge, entering Dracula's castle through the front gate, and is generally regarded as the easier of the 2 routes. The lower route is harder and takes player through a series of underground tunnels and cavernous areas, eventually scaling the cliffside below the castle, and is generally considered more difficult than the upper route. The lower route also features one short branching section of its own at stage 6. The 2 paths converge in the main hall of the castle. After the 3rd game's release, there were other titles for the Game Boy where Christopher Belmont is the main hero: Castlevania The Adventure and Belmont's Revenge. However, The Adventure will be remade for the Wii Virtual Console as Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. Castlevania Legends was also another title which featured the first female Belmont, Sonia. Unfortunately, Sonia was non-canon, much to the chagrin of many fans up until this day. Bloodlines was another successful title for the Sega Genesis, in which our heroes would travel the world fighting monsters, demons, and even Countess Bathory herself. According to history, Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess known as the biggest mass murderer of her time. She had kidnapped, tortured, and killed over 600 young women, and bathed in their blood. Castlevania also had 2 Super NES titles that were very successful: Super Castlevania 4, which was a remake of the original game, and Dracula X, which was a Super NES port of the TurboGrafx-16 Castlevania game, Rondo of Blood, which would be remade for the PSP as the Dracula X Chronicles. Rondo of Blood tells a story of Richter Belmont in which he rescues Maria Renard, who becomes his sidekick, and rescues 3 other women, including his girlfriend Annette, who happens to be Maria's older sister. In Dracula X Chronicles, if Richter or Maria failed to rescue Annette, they would fight against her in the clock tower when she becomes a lesser vampire. The original Rondo of Blood featured anime sequences, and Richter also unleashed the true power of the sub-weapons, such as a Grand Cross, for example. A major turning point in the gameplay mechanics of the series was Symphony of the Night, released 20 years ago for the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn in 1998. Expanding on the open-ended style of the gameplay previously used in Simon's Quest, Symphony of the Night style of gameplay has been termed Metroidvania due to its similarities with the non-linear and exploration-focused side-scrolling games of the Metroid franchise. It also used role-playing video game elements such as collectible weapons, armor, and hidden orbs. Many subsequent Castlevania games have since followed this template. Ayami Kojima's art was introduced in Symphony of the Night, and has been featured in a few other titles as well. Years later, the first 2 Castlevania games for the Nintendo DS returned to the anime style used in Rondo of Blood, among other titles, in hopes of broadening the player demographic, but not discouraging slightly younger Nintendo DS owners to be put off by Kojima's art. Dawn of Sorrow was the first game to do this, and the second DS release of Portrait of Ruin followed with the same style. The first games in the series to employ 3D graphics were Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness for the Nintendo 64 in 1999. In 2003, The next 3D Castlevania title featured combat-oriented hack-and-slash gameplay that drew comparisons to Devil May Cry, the 2001 title, though Lament of Innocence introduced several unique features to set itself apart from Capcom's title. The game has also drawn comparisons to the 2002 release Rygar the Legendary Adventure and the 2005 game God of War, both which use similar chain blade weapons, while the latter use also similarly flashy and smooth attacks that could change direction in the middle of a combo.